A central, in fact, a core text of the Scripture, and therefore of Judaism, is one that we read just several weeks ago, Leviticus 19, 1 and 2. Be holy as I, the Lord your God, am holy. And then it expands a little further in verses 16 to 18 as to what all that means. The foundation for this was laid at Mount Sinai itself. In Exodus 19, 5 and 6, God called out and he said, "You will be my treasured possession, a holy nation, a kingdom of priests." So, not surprisingly, we're reminded of the centrality of this particular concept of being holy. We're reminded of the centrality of this concept daily in our prayers, weekly, on Shabbat, seasonally in every one of our holidays. In other words, we're talking about the third paragraph of the Amidah. Blessed are you, O Lord, the holy God. And as we saw from tonight's Tehillat Brit Chadashah from the book of Revelation, this understanding, this concept underlies the whole of Scripture from Genesis to Revelation. Well, let me pause it. Not technically from Genesis to Revelation, but Leviticus to Revelation. Is that close enough? Okay, good. Now, last week, Dr. Patrice gave us an insightful and incisive analysis of this concept of holiness. Tonight, what I want to do is to build on that framework and to explore this concept and its implications just a bit further. As she pointed out last week, there are two aspects of sanctification. There is the divine act, and there are human actions. And when we get to that text in Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6, where God describes us as his own treasured possession, we are told this: "Now you will be my very own treasure," reading from our Pew Bibles, which, by the way, is, although it's connected to David Stern, the Older Testament text is technically from the Jewish Publication Society. It says, anyhow, "Now you will be my very own treasure from among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you will be a kingdom of priests," or Kohanim, "for me, a nation set apart." And all of those terms embody this concept of holiness. When God did that, that was the divine act. But tonight, I want to focus more on human actions. You see, if I were challenged, or if I challenge you to present a one-sentence, if you would have it, pithy articulation of the overarching responsibility of a Jew in this world, and therefore those who have aligned themselves with us as well, I would be hard-pressed to find a better phrasing than the second word of the Parshat Kedoshim. Kedoshim tiyu, ki kadosh, ani Adonai Elohim. Be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Now that is amazing. We've entered into somewhat a touch of the aspect of the holiness of God through the service this evening, and now God says, "As I am, so I want you to be." Wow. Now, this fundamental challenge to all of us, regardless of social standing or economic circumstance, this challenge is to sanctify, as the term is used, both time and space. To sanctify both time and space. What do you mean by sanctify? It's a term that's related to holy. It means to elevate, or perhaps it means to make sacred or make special. All that's inherent within this particular term. Now, every blessing, every bracha that we recite serves the purpose of making an ordinary action into a sacred one, whether it's eating bread all the way through to acknowledging grief and joy. And so we have traditionally pages and pages, literally, of brachot, or blessings, that are there to enable us to take the ordinary and move it into the extraordinary because of our encounter to God. Because in every circumstance, we are to look for an opportunity to thank God. A great rabbi put it this way in two separate texts. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 20, he said, "For everything give thanks." And then in 1 Thessalonians 5:18, he slightly rephrased it and said, "In every situation or circumstance, give thanks." He was talking about the brachot that are part of our traditions. So on Shabbat, where we find ourselves, as the great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel from the last generation taught us so eloquently, on Shabbat, we are sanctifying time. So making it special, making it sacred, elevating it. So through these acts, we are, as the text implies in Leviticus, being godlike. Be holy as I, the Lord your God, am holy. Judaism is saturated with this idea. And early Christianity integrated the fundamental teaching as well, referring to it through the Latin imitatio Dei, namely imitate or mimic God. To be sure, this is the quintessential foundational message that underlies most of Jewish teaching and practice. Be holy. As I was reviewing this afternoon, my mind jumped to another text, which I think is in one sense an midrashic elaboration on this, where Yeshua said, as the Old English translates it, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Now the Greek term there, I won't bore you with the Greek, because basically probably only John Geddes and myself would be interested in the Greek, perhaps Dr. Patrice and one other, is translated into Hebrew, into the modern Hebrew in an interesting fashion. It's not a term that you would normally expect. The term is shalem. Now, you don't need to know a whole lot of Hebrew to understand what that term is connected to. Shalem of all things. Because shalom reminds us of the harmony and the wholeness that is to exist in a situation or relationship. So he's describing that kind of thing we are to be involved in. A related term is one that we find frequently, tamim. As with the Greek, so also that Hebrew means complete or whole, filled out fully, properly, holy. Holy spelled this time with a W, not just with an H. Now, the why of the command is quite clear. We are to, as to use the Latin, imitate God. We are to be holy because God is holy. On the other hand, while the why is relatively simple, the how is harder to articulate. Other than the recitation of the blessings I referred to at every opportunity, how does one live a holy life? The simplest answer would be to observe the mitzvot, the behaviors based on the guidelines found in the Torah and its further elaborations, the network of prescriptions that constitute the guideposts for life. As we reminded ourselves in the response, what is it, O Israel, Deuteronomy 10, the Lord your God requires of you? Just this, to fear him, to serve him, to love him, to walk in all his ways. In other words, to take a walk with God. You know, like Noah did. Noah walked with God. Or Enoch did. Enoch walked with God. Or Jacob did. Jacob too walked with God, if you understand the name Tom or Ishtam. But the question goes deeper than that. Some would suggest, and in fact have done so, that withdrawing from modern life and its possibilities is a necessary prerequisite to the quest for holiness. But that has never been the way of classic Judaism, either ideologically or practically. You see, we have, since our earliest days, been committed to engaging secular culture. Even more to the point, our understanding of Jewish tradition is that it grew into what it is today precisely because of our sustained engagements with the cultures with which we have historically lived. That engagement was a positive force in our continued development as a religion and of our traditions. Judaism is not a monastic tradition. Asceticism has never been part of mainstream Jewish practice. Rather, we believe in engaging life and celebrating it. That's why we respond so often with the cry, L'chaim, to or for life. We believe in engaging life and celebrating it, and that's why we multiply our celebrations. So much so to the extent that we can say, Uvarchata b'chaim, choose life, as Deuteronomy 30 verses 19 to 20 reminds us in one of Moses' final exhortations to the Israelites before his death. He says, choose life so that you may live, that you may love the Lord your God, listen to his voice, hold fast to him. That's what life is about in the holiness track. So, if we are to live in this world and enjoy its blessings and its opportunities, how shall we be holy? By the way, do note, if you didn't, as we've been going through the readings, when we got to Leviticus 19, it was literally the heart of the Torah. If you look carefully at the scroll, it was virtually dead center in the scroll. It reinforces the importance of holiness, to be holy like our God is holy. So no wonder Rav Shaul could say in Romans chapter 7, verse 12, concerning the Torah, it is holy and righteous. And don't forget the last part too, it's good. But what's holiness all about? Interestingly, Dr. Patrice and I had an extended discussion or interaction over this on our way back, on our flight back from Philadelphia. And we talked in terms of the way holiness is viewed and the way in which holiness is skewed. And I don't want to be offensive when I say this, but I do need to at least be clear. There is a typical Christian view that is not the typical Jewish view. The typical Christian view down through the years has lended itself to describe holiness as monastic, as being separatists. In later days, through history, it is viewed as being Puritan, even later as being Victorian. Just think in terms of what those kinds of holinesses brought to us. In our day and age, or in the last generation or two, it's often associated with being fundamentalist. In other words, it's tilted toward the negative. What you stay away from. It's skewed toward separation, withdrawing from stuff. But this is not the Jewish view. The Jewish view is encapsulated at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, as Levi HaShliach records it for us. Matthew 5:13-16, Yeshua tells us, "One, you're the salt of the earth." Friends, salt is no good unless it comes into contact with that which is to be salted, right? It's got to interact. Then he says, you're the light of the world. Of what good, then he says, is light that's hidden behind some obstruction? Rather, he says, you put a light on a stand and it gives light to everyone in the house. In other words, it interacts and intersperses with things around. In the same way, then, Yeshua says, let your light shine before people so that they may see your good deeds, your mitzvot, and praise your Father in heaven. First, he reflects on the behavior stamped and shaped by Torah and its unwrapping, and then it talks about praising your Father in heaven. The Hebrew for this is the concept known as Kiddush Hashem. You live in such a way that others look at the way in which you live and say, thank God for what this person is doing. Notice the text, or the concept it's applied here rabbinically, is Kiddush. The Hebrew term is Kadosh. It's related to that whole perspective. In other words, it is, in effect, living like one of my favorite texts, which I shared yet again for the umpteenth time in the yeshiva class last night, Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 5-8. It's the wow text, where Moses says, if you follow these guidelines, the nations of the world will look at you and they will say, wow. What a wise and understanding people this is, that has a God so near to them and he hears their prayer and has such wonderful laws as these. In other words, we live a life that reflects in such a way that it attracts. Now, by the way, the prophets, the rabbis understood, you can't do this in your own strength. And so God promised for us through Ezekiel 36, 25-27, that he would not only transform us from the inside out, he would place his spirit, the Ruach Hashem, in us to enable us, the text says quite clearly, to walk according to his instructions and guidelines. Which is why, as I've reminded you from time to time, the rabbi of old in Romans 8:4 said, here's what it means to walk by the Spirit. If you walk by the Spirit, you fill the righteous requirements of the Torah. That's what it's all about when we responded. Hear, O Israel, what does the Lord require of you? Yeah, to love him, to serve him, but to walk in all his ways. And in complete keeping or accord with this, Yeshua said the same thing. He said, whoever has my commands and keeps them, that's the one who loves me. In other words, we're right now back to the Shema. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, strength, and life. And by the way, in case you forgot what that means, keep reading the text. He says, these commandments are to be on your hearts, impress them on your children, and throughout the whole of life, inside, outside, sitting up, sitting down, standing up. These are to be part of your life. That's holiness. The great medieval commentator, Ramban Nachmanides, said that Kedoshim to you, from Leviticus 19, was best translated simply as Kedoshim to you. Some of you will recognize that term. It's the term from which the term Pharisees comes from. He's saying, be separate, is the idea. You see, the idea of sanctification or separation, properly understood, is both systemically and systematically embedded in Judaism. And so on Friday night, what we have done is what we always do. We separate Friday from Shabbat by lighting the candles. And then we separate Shabbat from Saturday night by reciting Havdalah, a prayer whose name literally means separation. In other words, we set it apart, make it sacred. Sacredify, if you want to coin a term, a verb form. There you go. Add that to your next words with friends. Similarly, the word lehavdil is used to characterize the differentiation between kosher and non-kosher animals. So by separating, distinguishing the two categories, we fashion, as it were, what should we call it, a culinary holiness? So the path to a holy life, and I use the term path very intentionally because it is a path. The path to a holy life is to separate ourselves from those aspects of the surrounding culture that are antithetical to our tradition, both in a legal sense, in that they overtly violate halakha, and in the broader sense, in that they look and feel wrong from a Jewish ethos or from a Jewish perspective. But still, once again, how does one extrapolate from this concept to more concrete standards of behavior? Back to the text we looked at just a few moments ago. Walk in all his ways, Deuteronomy. Live in such a way that the nations look at you and say, wow. Impress these things on your heart. What things? The guidelines I've given to you as part of your everyday life. Be salt, be light, as Yeshua said. Now, for the sake of complete transparency, additionally, one might say that the glorification of and the drive for material wealth and materialism, acquiring status and stuff for power and position, that which so permeates mainstream U.S. culture, flies in the very face of Judaism's teaching, which is so beautifully expressed in Pirkei Avot, which sometimes is simply entitled Ethics of the Ancestors, and that's what it is. Pirkei Avot tells us that the truly wealthy person is one who is satisfied with whatever he or she has. Judaism has no prohibition against being wealthy, but the constant longing for greater riches and influence is not a Jewish value. It's not a biblical value. Separating ourselves from that idea, making a distinction there, from that idea, which is so much a part of contemporary U.S. culture, that would be then for us an essential component of the quest for a holy life. You see, the challenge of the Jews and the challenge for the Jews is to swim against the tide of society. But this core text of Judaism, Leviticus 19, this central or core text of Scripture answers another, yet essential, related question, which is, what are our responsibilities to the larger world in light of all this? That passage from several weeks ago provides an answer to these questions, these queries, by teaching what is perhaps the most famous lesson of the Torah, that you will love your neighbor as yourself, in that same text that we've been talking about but a few paragraphs later. If you would have it, it's the golden rule. It's a simple yet complex teaching. So how are we to understand it? In the way Hillel spelled out for us? Whatever you don't want done to you, don't do that to somebody else. A generation later, Yeshua used that and reminded us of the flip side of that. Let me make sure I get this right. Do to others what you would want to have done to you. Yeshua's closest follower, Yochanan HaShliach, 1 John chapter 3, verses 17 and 18 said, look, if you have possessions and your neighbor has needs, you are to, pardon paraphrase, but that's what he's saying, you are to apply those possessions to those needs. Otherwise, you can't say that the love of God resides in you. Or, what we find near the end of Deuteronomy. When you are harvesting, don't muzzle the ox that you are using to to harvest with. Because even the ox should get a part of what's going on. Whereas we're told in the Torah as well, don't harvest the corners of your fields. In other words, share what you have with others. And we can go on and on and on with texts from the Torah on this. By the way, one of the birds deemed non-kosher by the Torah is a bird called the chasidah. What is chasidah? We know it of as that wonderful, almost mythical creature, the stork. Now, the Talmud says that it is called chasidah because it demonstrates chesed to its fellow birds. Care, concern, reaching out in a loving fashion. It demonstrates chesed to its fellow birds in feeding them, and maybe in the mythology to humans by supplying them with babies, but whatever. Now, in the 1800s, a rabbi known as the Kotzker Rebbe asked, this is delightful, if the Hasidah is kind towards its kin, then why is it unkosher? He answers, to be truly kosher, you have to be kind not only to your own kind, but to all. Nicely done. Because after all, love has or should have no boundaries. In keeping with that, there was an elderly couple who had just learned how to text, how to send text messages on their cell phones. Now, the wife was the romantic type, but the husband was more of a no-nonsense guy. So one afternoon, the wife went out to meet a friend for coffee, and she decided to send her husband a romantic text message. So she wrote, if you are sleeping, send me your dreams. If you are laughing, send me your smile. If you are eating, send me a bite. If you are drinking, send me a sip. If you are crying, send me your tears. I love you. Nice. And to this beautifully romantic text, the husband texted back to her, I'm on the toilet. Please advise. Love has no boundaries. Well, yet another rabbi, many centuries before the Kotzker Rebbe, unwrapped our text even further, and you'll recognize the words as he comments on the text. He says, concerning love, it always protects, it always trusts, it always hopes, it always perseveres. Or as one of our Pew Bibles, or the one we used to use as the Pew Bible, put it so very nicely, if you love someone, you will be loyal to him or to her, no matter what the cost. You will always believe in him or her. You will always expect the best of him or her. And you will always stand your ground in defending him or her. If you say you love someone and you don't do that, guess what, gang? It ain't love. Let me unwrap the text just a little bit here. It always protects. If it hears something bad about someone else, it protects the person's reputation. If it hears more bad stuff, it nevertheless trusts, the second phrase, that what is being heard or repeated is not true. And even as the evidence mounts up, it hopes that somehow the evidence is incorrect. And even if it is, it always perseveres and stands in love. Always stand your ground in defending the person. Friends, if you are not doing that to your neighbor, your friend, your kin, or your non-kin, it isn't love. Now the rabbi adds one other thing that I want to tack on here because it's appropriate. It's Philippians chapter 2, verse 3. It says in humility, he tells us in humility, consider others as better than yourself. Consider others as better than yourself. Imagine if we followed those simple rules in those texts how much different our lives would be with one another. I saw this article in the paper, see, this is the 16th, so almost 3 weeks ago. And it's appropriate here. It was on the front page of the Tampa Bay Times. It says, occasionally fate can take a familiar narrative and slather it in pine tar. Talking about a baseball game in case you're wondering. That's why it caught my attention. And slather it in pine tar. Just to give it that little something extra, to mesmerize, to create movement. It was not merely that the final pitch of Florida Southern senior Chelsea Ogilvy's career, the final pitch was sent soaring into the Lakeland sky, nor was it the timing, though Eckerd's sophomore Kara Oberer's 3-run home run with 2 outs in the top of the 7th clinched a 4-2 Triton's victory. By the way, in women's softball, 7 innings, not 9, just to keep on the same page. So it wasn't merely that. After hurling her final pitch a bit high and outside and watching Oberer whip her bat and her upper torso around to apply enough force on the ball to send it over the fence, Ogilvy's heart did not sink. It enlarged. You see, with a runner on second base in the first inning of Saturday's first game, and now the article's talking about the batter, Ogilvy, she lunged to her left for a chopper up the middle and felt her right knee lock up. Essentially, she thought that the 84-degree heat or physical effects from Friday's marathon caused her legs to cramp. Oberer got up and tried to put pressure on the leg. After the next pitch, she waved for her manager to take her out. I tried icing it down and re-stretching it, she said. I could walk a little bit, and then I tried to run, and it would just lock right back up. That was in the first inning. Now back to the 7th. Unaware that the ball was in the process of clearing the left field fence, Oberer, the batter, ran as hard as she could to first before the knee locked completely up, forcing her to hop on her left leg the last few feet. She recalls a coach reminding her to stop. As per NCAA rules, a pinch runner could have been inserted and the homer would have stood. Any physical assistance from coaches or trainers, and she would have been out. Meantime, Oberer's pain intensified, turning her winces into tears. Through them, she saw the pitcher, Ogilvy, approaching. It was a bomb. There was no way she didn't deserve the home run, Ogilvy said. As soon as she hit first base and her team couldn't help her anymore, Oberer was just absolutely sobbing. She literally couldn't put one foot in front of the other. Ogilvy says, I was like, there's no way this girl isn't going to make it home. As second baseman Leah Pemberton approached, Ogilvy wrapped Oberer's left arm around her shoulders. Following her pitcher's lead, Pemberton, a Bloomingdale High School graduate, did the same with Oberer's right arm. Except to gently touch second, third, and home, Oberer's feet never touched the ground the rest of the way around. That, my friends, is holy living. And it's your choice. Take the next minute or so for a time of reflection and response in quiet.